Romans chapter 2. And of course, Paul is still in the middle of this argument that started back in chapter 1, verse 18, and continues for a little bit. And so here we're going to pick it up in verse 17. So chapter 2, verse number 17. Paul writes, "Behold, thou art called a Jew, and resteth in the law, and makest thy boast of God, and knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light to them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which hast the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. Thou therefore which taking the law dishonorest thou God, and for the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written." And we'll pause right there for the morning. Now, as I just said, since verse 18 of chapter 1, Paul has been systematically showing that people are without excuse. That has been the sole purpose, really, of Paul's argumentation since chapter 1, verse 18, and will continue on through chapter 3. And this is of vital importance that people understand that they are without excuse. There is no hope outside of Christ. No one will stand before God in judgment as innocent without, as April just sang about, without the blood of Christ having covered their sins. Nothing but the blood really means nothing but the blood, right? Without the blood, there is no innocence before God. And so Paul has been, like I said, he's for the Gentile. Now, in the last, or the beginning part of chapter 2, he kind of generally spoke of Jew and Gentile alike, and now he turns his attention to the Jew specifically, right? And so what he's doing is he's showing not enough. It still is not enough to save an individual. And so he's going to, again, continue this systematic tearing down of the walls which make people so comfortable that just think, well, I've done enough good. Right, or I'll just be okay because, you know, even if God exists, He's a loving God, and so I'll be okay. And so he's tearing down all these walls, and it leads us to the Jewish person. Now, the Bible consistently shows us that the Jewish people were very the religious leaders. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, those on the Sanhedrin, but it would apply really to most of them in general. And so there was not another people group who felt more secure in their position with God without actually being secure in a position with God than the Jewish people. And so Paul gives them some very pointed words. And he doesn't mince his words here. We'll see it as we go. He gives them some very pointed words in order to pull the wool from their eyes. And at the end of that gospel presentation, they don't realize that they are a sinner who has not presented them the truth. And so Paul's not being mean. He's not being harsh. He is lovingly guiding them to the truth of Christ and the gospel of Christ. Now, again, we're reading through an entire work. We're taking that work in sections. And so, yes, if this is all that we had, we might think, well, Paul's being a little rude here, but this isn't all we have. We're going to get into the glorious truths of the gospel, but Paul is building his case step by step. And so we're walking our way up the staircase of the gospel. And so we'll see that as we make our way through the book of Romans, okay? And so, there again, we are talking, now there are still applications to make. We'll get to those at the end. But here Paul is specifically talking to the first century religious Jew. Okay, that's who this is, that's just talking about. But again, there's truths, there's principles to be seen. And so he said, first of all, "Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God." Now here, Jew, the word Jew is being contrasted with the term Greek. Okay, and so he talked about Greeks do certain things. Here he's talking about Jews do certain things. And so they are called Jews, meaning this is the definition of their nationality, as Greek designated the nationality of the Gentile. Okay, and so this is a nationalistic argumentation that Paul is making. They took tremendous pride in the fact that they were Jews, which by the time of Paul essentially became synonymous with being the specially called apart people of God. Right? And so if you were, at this particular time, if you called yourself a Jew, you meant a couple of things. You meant, one, ethnically that you were Jewish. It was a nationality. But also you meant, I am part of that special, called apart people of God. Right? And so the term Jew, even that term, became a very a source of pride for this particular people. Now, a couple of things I want to say. There's nothing wrong with taking pride in who you are. There's nothing wrong with taking pride in your heritage. There's nothing wrong with taking pride. I mean, here we are, July 4th weekend. There's nothing wrong in taking pride in the fact that we're Americans. I'm proud that I am born in this country. I love this country. Yes, it has a lot of problems. Yes, I want to see a lot of things happen. But that doesn't mean that I'm not proud to be an American. There's nothing wrong with that. However, for them, for the Jewish people, it didn't stop at being proud of their heritage. It became a boast about their heritage. It became, not only am I thinking, well, I'm better than you because I'm an American, right? I am an inherently better individual because I'm American and you're not, right? I have just overstepped a pride in my heritage, and I have entered into a sinful pride. And so they begin to see themselves, again, as better than the Gentile, not because they had the law, we'll get to that in a moment, but just because they were Jews. Just that in of itself, because they had these privileges, because they were God's people, they begin to see themselves as inherently better. And so, the Jews were given the law. And our text here in verse 17, it says that they rest in it. Right? And so that they rest in the law. And so by that it means that they rested on the fact that they were given the law, not on the fact that they did what the law commanded. Okay, so we have to understand here, Paul is critiquing. He's not commending. Right? Paul is not saying, hey, it's a great thing that you rest upon the law. No, he's saying it became a source of pride. There is a critique to be made because you rest upon the law. In other words, the very fact that they were given the law was a source of pride. In other words, as Jews, we're better than you because we have the law and you don't. Right? And so, again, inherently, we're better than you, and so we can look down our noses at you, and we can think that you're dogs, and we can say all these nasty things about you specifically because we have the law. Mind you, not because we're following it, and because we're holy. It's just because God chose us, and he didn't choose you. Right? That was their source of pride. And so they didn't care if they actually followed the law. It just mattered that they were the ones who had it, and the Gentiles didn't. Right? And so, again, it was a source of pride. That led to boasting. Now, again, outside of the context in which Paul is speaking, this would sound like a good thing. If all we had was verse 17, and it wasn't in the context of this broader argument that Paul is making, verse 17 sounds good. Right? You're a Jew. You're called a Jew. You rest in the law. You're making your boast of God. If that's all we had, we'd think, well, praise God. Right? That sounds wonderful. But it is in the context of a broader argument, and Paul's going to make his way to the critiques here in just a moment. And so we have to understand the context in which Paul is speaking for us to understand the critique that is being made. And so because I say this, it's a good thing for us to boast about God. We should boast about God. It should be a boast for a Christian to tell other people how great is the God that we serve. In fact, we read in Psalm 44, in God we boast all the day long and praise thy name forever. It should be said about Christians. Man, they're always boasting about their God. We should do that. That's a good thing to do. However, again, their boast was not in how great God was, but in how great it was that he was their God and not the Gentile God. Right? Again, it was a source of pride. And by the way, this was nothing new. The prophet Micah. In Micah chapter 3, Micah is revealing some of the sins that were taking place in Israel by the priests and the prophets. And he's talking about these terrible, awful, sinful things that they're doing. And then he says, and here's what the nation thinks about this. And so the priests, the prophets, they're sinning, and here's what you say about their sin. They say, yet will they lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? None evil can come upon us. And so the same thing is taking place where that sounds good, but the context is essentially you think because you're God's people you can do whatever you want and nothing bad will ever happen to you. You think you can do whatever you want and God's just going to give you a giant pass, that no harm will come upon you. And so it wasn't that they were just resting upon God and saying, if God be for us, who can be against us? No, it's, well, God's on our side, so I can do whatever I want. That's been the sentiment of the Jewish people since the time of Micah and now on into the time of Paul. And so essentially you had a first century Jew who was following the law, who was doing the things that they were supposed to be doing, who was sanctified and being obedient and faithful to all that God had prescribed in the law. And then over here was this Gentile man who is just sinning and is a pagan, doing all the pagan things. And the Jewish man is looking at him with the heartfelt love of, that's all it was. mindset of the person that Paul is talking about. And so they felt superior. They felt superior because they noticed his will, and they approved the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law. And so again, had special revelation of God where he revealed more of himself to the Jewish people than he did to anybody else. Again, that's true. Psalm 147, he showeth his word unto Jacob, his statutes and his judgments unto Israel. He hath not dealt so with any nation. They did have this truth. They did have this knowledge. The natural law of the Gentile, right? We just talked about this last week where the Gentile does things in themselves, having a law written in their hearts because of their conscience, right? So God has placed within all people a sort of law. It wasn't to the degree of the law that the Jews had, but there is a sort of a law built into the heart of every man, teaching them the law, teaching them about God. And so, again, all this, Paul is basically making the point. You had incredible advantage. You had incredible privilege. You had every advantage that the Gentile did not have. However, one can know God's will, and one can know what is right and what is wrong, and still fail to do God's will, and still fail to do what is right and do what is wrong, right? And so they had the knowledge, but their knowledge, here's the problem, never informed their actions. They had the knowledge, but it never went as far as acting out the knowledge that they had. And so again, the common Jew of Paul's day, and again, that's not to say that every single Jewish man and woman did this exact thing, but that this general knowledge. And so they had great pride in the fact that God called them and that God had instructed them. But the problem is they never took great pride in actually following God. And that's where the problems came in. And so again, you can read through the Old Testament, and you can see that the knowledge and the law didn't change. God gave them the Old Testament. They had by the time of Paul, they didn't have more knowledge than they had before. They had the same knowledge, they had the same Old Testament. The law certainly didn't change. They had the same law. But consistently throughout Israel's history, they were what? They were disobedient. Consistently throughout Israel's history, they failed to keep the law. They failed to do the things that God called them to do in the law. Now, nobody could do it perfectly. We understand that. That's why what Christ came to do was above and beyond what any human could actually do, and that he kept the law. But that was never even an attempt by the average Jewish person. It just became a prideful thing that I had it. I don't necessarily care that I do it. And so because of the advantages they had, there were certain things expected of them. And this is where we get into verse 19 here. And he says, "And art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which has the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law." And so their knowledge of God, this is something we've talked about kind of at length in the past, but their knowledge of God was never something that they were supposed to just bottle up and keep for themselves. All right? God did not reveal himself to the Jews and say, please don't tell anybody else. Please keep this to yourself. This isn't knowledge that I want to be known by people outside of Israel. No, God blessed them and gave them these privileges, gave them these advantages so that they would essentially become the Levites for the world. Right? So the Jewish people had the Levites, the tribe of Levites, who were supposed to be teaching them the law, teaching them the things of God. And in turn, as they found them out, as they knew them, as they gained knowledge, then they were supposed to teach them. They were supposed to shine brightly for the world to see the God that they served. And so in Leviticus chapter 10, God is instructing Aaron, and he tells him that it was the duty of the Levites to teach the children blind. The Gentiles sat in darkness. Now get this, not because they were inherently more sinful than the Jew, but because they didn't have the revelation that God gave the Jew. And so it wasn't that Jews were just inherently better, it's that they had certain things given to them by God that the Gentiles didn't. And so because of this, right, that would be a foolish way to see a child. No, there's somebody who needs to be taught. And there's somebody who, if they had the same knowledge that I had, you would consider them to be equal and at the same level. And so the Jews were supposed to be that teacher. The Jews were supposed to be guiding the Gentiles to the God that the Gentiles should have been able to see was good and holy and loving and kind and would bless the one who worshiped him. And they were supposed to be able to see that because of the sanctified lives of the Israelites. Unfortunately, they never saw that picture. Unfortunately, they were never given that clear representation of the God that Israel served. Douglas Moo, he said, the Jews, however, far short of their responsibility to enlighten the Gentile world they may have fallen, continued to boast in these mandates as a means of highlighting their importance and the value of their law in the eyes of a skeptical and sometimes hostile Gentile world. In other words, they didn't care if they were actually teaching the world about God. They cared that they were the ones with the knowledge to teach. Again, if I'm a teacher in a classroom, I don't look down upon the student because they don't have my level of knowledge. My job is to give them my level of knowledge. And my job is to make sure that they understand what I'm trying to teach them. Right? It would be, again, a very prideful way for a teacher to look down their nose and think, well, I am inherently better than you because I have knowledge you don't. Right? There's a difference in somebody being ignorant and just plain stupid. Right? Somebody who's just plain stupid has the knowledge or has the information, they just don't get it. Somebody who's ignorant has just never been given the knowledge. Somebody, they've never had the information. That was the Gentile. And so Paul here was saying, you were supposed to guide them. They were blind. They were in darkness. Lead them out of the darkness. Let them see the God that you serve. Now they were confident. Again, that's the word he uses in verse 19. They were confident. And they had the ability to teach. They had everything they needed because they had the form of knowledge and of the truth and the law. It's not as if they said, well, we would love to teach them, we just don't know what to teach them. No, they had been given everything that they needed. Right? The Jewish person was set up in the right position to be the teacher that they needed to be, just like the Christian today. We have the knowledge that we need. We have the Bible. We have God's Word to humanity. We have everything we need to be the teacher to the lost world that we need to be. We need to understand it. We need to read it. We need to memorize it. We need to meditate upon it. We need to know it ourselves. But there is no excuse for the Christian today to say, well, God, I would love to teach them, but I just don't know what to teach them. No, we have it. It's there. It's there for us to know and to understand and to delve into ourselves so that we can then teach everybody else. So Paul isn't denying that they claimed or that they had what they claimed to have. He's simply pointing out that what they had never produced in them what it should. You have the knowledge. You have the privilege. You are the called people of God. God has blessed you in ways that he has not blessed others by his choice. He could have blessed them how he blessed you. He chose not to. He chose you. He blessed you in ways that he didn't bless them. And so it should have produced within you this zeal to not only love him, but to bring everybody else into the fold. And say, hey, come serve the God that we serve. Look how good he is. Look how loving he is. Look how kind he is. Look how benevolent he is. But instead, you took all the blessings that he gave to you and said, well, you're just a dirty, rotten dog, and you don't deserve what I have. Anytime that we as Christians look down our noses at the world in that same way, we are acting as the first century Jew. We are acting as the self-righteous person who says, I have what I have and you don't deserve it because you're some dirty, rotten sinner. Anytime we think that, we are belittling our own sin. We are saying, as if I deserved it and you don't. No, none of us deserve it. None of us deserve it. And so they did have knowledge. They did have the truth of God. They did have all that they needed to have to be guides, to be teachers, but unfortunately they turned privilege into pride. And that was the problem. At some point along the way, right? At some point after God brought them out of slavery in Egypt, they eventually saw that calling of God as instead of as a privilege to inform others about, as a source of pride to look down upon others. James Dunn, he said, the implication indeed is that the Jew as such is not fulfilling the role of Israel, that he is mistaking his priorities, that he has misunderstood God. Well, as a get-out-of-jail-free card. I can do whatever I want. I can live however I want. I can think whatever I want about you, and it don't matter because I'm one of the called ones. I'm one of God's people. I can do whatever I want. This is what Paul gets to. And so Paul then here in the last few verses here, he kind of lays out a series of rhetorical questions. And if you were a Jewish person reading this, all of these, particularly verse 24, but all of these should have been just a punch right in the gut. You should have felt these. Okay, and so right here, verse 21, it says, thou therefore which teachest another, it says, teachest thou not thyself? Right? Why don't you start with you first? Right? Why don't you understand what it is you're supposed to be teaching? And so he asks these questions, again, which would tear down the foundations of the self-righteous Jew. And so, again, the Jews had knowledge, they had truth, they had every privilege, they had every advantage, but they simply did not respond properly. That was the issue. They did not respond properly. And so, again, you have, you're supposed to teach another. Don't you teach yourself first? You have the knowledge to teach others to follow the law. Why have you not taught yourself to do that? Right? You have been given everything by God. Why don't you start at home? Again, what you do is, as I said this earlier, what you do is more important than what you know. That's not to say that what you know is not important, but what you do is more important than what you know. How can I say that? Chapter 2, verse 6. God in his judgment will render to every man according to what? Not his knowledge. Will render to every man according to his deeds. Now, your deeds are going to be based on what you know. You're going to do what you know to do. But what you do is more important than what you know, because if all you have is knowledge and there's no action, you have failed to do what you're supposed to do. And so action is more important than knowledge, and that's what Paul is saying here. You have the knowledge. Why didn't you teach yourself to do it? Right? And so what you do is more important than what you know. And so to illustrate this fact, he asks 3 questions. He says, thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? And so again, he says, y'all have the knowledge of this law, the law of God, but you're not doing it. You don't even care to do it. And I'll prove that, right? I'll prove that, and I'll prove it by these 3 questions. And so essentially Paul was saying, look at what your own law says, that law that you take so much pride in, and see how you fail in keeping that very law. Right? We have to keep that in mind. This is a generalization. But Jesus in Matthew 21:13, very famously, when he's driving out the people out of the temple, what does he say? He says, my house shall be called the house of prayer, but you sacrifice. Well, over time, and as people were spread out farther away from the temple, instead of hauling my lamb all the way across Jerusalem, I'll just buy one when I get there. Right? And so the priests, they set up a system, right? Well, we have lambs acceptable for sacrifice. Because it couldn't just be any old. You had all these people in the court of the Gentiles setting up their shops, selling everything somebody could possibly need when they got into the temple, but they were ripping people off left and right. And it just became this accepted practice. And the priests were profiting from this. And so Jesus comes in, throws over the tables, shoos everybody out of there, and says, what? You have made it into a den of thieves. What? You're not even doing this to Gentiles. You're doing this to your own people. And so the law says don't steal, but you're stealing. The law says don't commit adultery, but what do you do? Stealing. The law says don't commit adultery, but what do? You commit adultery. Again, the words of Jesus, he says, whosoever therefore shall be ashamed of me and of my words, and then he says this, in this adulterous and sinful generation. Now again, that's a generalization. I understand that. But Jesus called the very generational act of adultery, but it most definitely included the act of adultery. You're an adulterous generation. Now the next one, let me explain it a little bit. The law says to abhor idols, but you're committing sacrilege. So what does that mean? Now the word sacrilege, there in verse 22, it's an interesting word. It's only used twice in the New Testament, and it literally means to rob a temple. To rob a temple, to rob a church. That's what the word literally means. The only other time it's used in the Bible is in Acts 19:37, and I'll explain that story here in just a second. But Acts 19:37 says, for you have brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches, nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. And so he says, they are not robbers of churches. That's this word. So when you read that word sacrilege there, that's the same word, robbers of churches. Now, there's not a specific example in the New Testament of this. I can't say, go to this verse and you're going to see where somebody robbed a church. We don't have that. However, that reference there in Acts 19:37 gives us a clue. Okay? And so the story there in Acts 19, just to say this quickly, Paul is preaching in Ephesus. And during his preaching, he says, all these idols that exist here in Ephesus, these are nothing. God is not worshipped by things made by the hand of man. That little idol that you blacksmiths are producing, you think that's a god? That's nothing. There's no power there. That's nothing. And so the blacksmiths got mad. They get mad at Paul because why? People are starting to believe them, and they're not buying their idols anymore. And so they're losing money. And so they cause this uproar, and soon enough this mob is formed, and the mob ends up taking some of the companions of Paul, and this big mob forms, and so they're afraid of what's going to happen to these companions of Paul, and then eventually, basically like the town clerk, stands up and says, hey, everybody needs to calm down, okay? Let's think about what's going through. Let's talk about this. And that's when he says, you've brought these guys, and they're not robbers of churches. They haven't done that. People came in, and they did rob some churches. These guys didn't do that. So you're getting mad at the wrong people. That's what he's saying. You're getting mad at the wrong people. And so essentially, this is an insinuation that this is something that was at least well known. And there's some historical evidence to back that up. That some of the Jewish people were going into temples and pagan temples and stealing the idols. And there's various ideas of why. Some people think they took them because a lot of times they were made with precious metals and things like that. But nevertheless, they're going in and doing that. But the law in Deuteronomy says that idols were to be burned. You don't take them to keep them. You don't take them because you desire them. Whore idols, but you're certainly not doing that either. Right? So all of these show them, here's what the law says, and yet you consistently fail, and yet you think you have the ability to take pride in a law that you don't follow. And it's, well, I won't get into all that. And so, let me move on. Taken together, all of this proves the hypocrisy of the Jewish people that he's talking about. It proves the hypocrisy of these Jews, leading Paul to ask this, thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law dishonorest thou God. You're boasting in the law, and yet you are dishonoring God by your breaking and disobedience of that very law that you're boasting in. Seems quite hypocritical. And so they thought the law made them superior. In an ironic twist, that thing that they thought made them superior actually showed them to be just as much a sinner than the people they thought they were superior from. You think you're better than them because of the law. Well, guess what? That law shows you to be just a dirty sinner dog like they are. It doesn't make you better. It makes you even. In fact, not only does it not make you better, it actually puts you in a worse position. Because by having the advantage and the knowledge that they didn't, you're now held to a higher standard that they're not held to. Right? And we talked about that at the beginning of chapter 2. And so not only does to show people, again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, without Christ, you have no hope. That law that you take so much pride in, it is not going to save you. It's not going to save you. You're taking pride in something that the only thing it does is show you that you have no hope. That's what that law does. We'll get there, right, as we move farther into the book of Romans. But he's laying down the foundations of the gospel. And so this all leads us to verse 24. And again, like I said, all of these things would have been a punch in the gut. You get to verse 24, and there's no doubt that if you were actually taking seriously the arguments of Paul, this one hurts. If you were a Jewish person, this one would have hurt. Verse 24, for the name of God is blasphemed because of you. Well, Paul, I don't like that. That one hurts, Paul. He alludes to Isaiah 52:5. Isaiah 52:5 says, my name continually every day is blasphemed. Now, again, they would have agreed with that. Nobody would have doubted that. But the sad thing is the blasphemy came as a result of the negligence of the Jewish people to do instead of just to know. Why are they blaspheming God? Because you have failed. Because you have failed. A failure of the student, though not always, I don't want to say this is always the case, but it can be and often is a big part of that ain't the teacher's fault. I understand that. but in just a normal situation, if I'm teaching somebody to something who has the capacity to learn and understand, and they fail to learn and understand, it probably says more about me, the teacher, than the student. And so here, Paul is saying, nobody is disagreeing with you that they're out there blaspheming God. Where we disagree is what. And so as I close, let me give you two quick applications with this. Number one, faithless sanctification leads to hell. Faithless sanctification leads to hell. The Jewish people, nobody would doubt this, the Jewish people were most certainly sanctified. That made them distinctly different from the Gentile world. Right? Nobody would question whether or not they were sanctified. They were set apart. But they were set apart because of their pride and tradition, instead of because they were serving the God who called them to be set apart to bring in the rest of the world. And so we're not called, as Christians today, we're not called to be set apart just so that we can be different. We're not called apart just because we want the world something to look at that makes them, seem different than the rest of the world. No, we're called to be set apart to give the world a glimpse of the perfect and holy otherness of the God that we serve. We're called to be set apart so that the world, getting so dissatisfied of the rat race that is the world and the sin and all the things that they get caught up in, we're called to be set apart so that they can see there actually is an alternative. I don't have to be stuck on the broad way. There is a narrow way. And the way that Christians live is supposed to show them, no, this isn't the only option. There actually is something different. And so we're called to be set apart, not just to be different. We're called to be set apart so that Christianity is unlike anything in the world because we serve the God who is the only light in a world full of darkness. And they should see that light. They should see that light in the way that we as Christians live. And so being set apart doesn't matter unless it's because of our faith in the one who has called us to be set apart. I mean, anybody can be different. Why you're different matters. Why you're different matters. So number one, faithless sanctification leads to hell. Number two, the privilege of knowing God carries responsibility. And we've talked about this. This isn't new here, but it is implicit in this text. The privilege of knowing God carries responsibility. And so as we've said before, it's more important to do than to know. Right? We've talked about that. It's more important to do than to know. If our knowledge does not lead to action, then it is no different than our knowledge of any other topic. What I know about God doesn't matter more than what I know about the Dallas Cowboys. If it's not leading me to do any action for the cause of Christ, then that knowledge doesn't matter more than any other piece of knowledge that I have in my life. Just as the Jews, our knowledge gives us the responsibility to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. That's what we are called to do with the knowledge that we have. And so again, if our knowledge of God has led us to do nothing for the cause of Christ, we look at us to do nothing for the cause of Christ, I have reasonable doubt that there's salvation to begin with. Reasonable doubt. I can't know. But Jesus said, by their fruits you will know them. Catch that. Not by their knowledge, by their fruit. How do I know? What gives me the illustration or the illusion that somebody is a believer or a follower of Christ? By what they do. That's what does it. And so our privilege of knowing God carries responsibility. If we did this, if we did actually did actions for the cause of Christ, if we were salt, if we were light, perhaps there would be a lot less blasphemy and a lot more glory. Glorify your Father which is in heaven. That's the goal. That's what we desire as Christians. Now, again, I'm not putting down the need to share the gospel and actually lay out what the gospel is. But I would submit it starts with the way you live your life. Because if you come to that person and they don't see fruit, why would they want what you have? Why would they want, if you're not offering them anything different from this old world, why do they care? And so our knowledge carries a responsibility for us to live out our faith so that the world can see it. And as a benefit, as we know, we've talked about this already, God will bless it and reward it eternally. And so we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to be light, to be salt. The Jewish people had the same responsibility, and they failed in this. Let us not fail in this. Let us do our job. Let's pray.